Hola, bienvenidos, welcome. Hi everyone, thanks for your patience as we get tonight's event started. It's my pleasure to have you join El Museo del Barrio here tonight for the public launch of Collective Magpie's participatory online poetic race survey, Who Designs Your Race? I'm Susanna Temkin, curator at El Museo del Barrio, and I'm one of the co-curators of the upcoming exhibition ESTAMOS BIEN, La Trienal, here alongside El Museo's chief curator, Rodrigo Mora, and also guest curator and artist, Elia Alba, who sadly couldn't be with us tonight, but she is watching, so hi, Elia. Tonight's program celebrates the launch of what is our fourth online artist project that El Museo has commissioned in advance of La Trienal, which will open in Las Galerías in spring 2021. So prior to the pandemic, we already knew we wanted to work with Collective Magpie in relation to their ongoing race survey project, particularly in light of this year's US Census, which coincidentally is ending tonight in New York. So if you haven't filled out the census, please make sure you do. However, in the wake of the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and so many others, and the wider awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement, the issue that's really at the center of Collective Magpie's project, i.e. race, made us realize how critical this survey was. And in fact, as Collective Magpie's artist statement reads, and as I think we'll get into tonight, I'm going to quote you, Melinda, quote, "Our intention is not to cure any kind of race issues, but in this current racial climate, we need, all in caps, to find more ways to approach thinking and talking about race." So with that, I want to turn to MR, aka Melinda Barnadas of Collective Magpie, who's going to start our conversation with a presentation that frames the context of the race survey, both historically and in terms of the practice of Collective Magpie. Before that, I also want to encourage you, our viewers, to use the chat box and the Q&A features if you have any thoughts or if you want to submit any questions that we'll try and get to before the end of tonight's program. So with that, Melinda, I'll briefly read a part of your interview, and I hope we'll get to your personal and artistic trajectory as well. But Melinda is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and researcher dedicated to engaging the public domain. As part of an interracial and intercultural duo of US immigrants, she and Korean American artist Tae Hwang established the public participatory Collective Magpie in 2008. While they define this practice as a nomadic effort, for most of the past decade, Collective Magpie projects have been primarily dedicated to the Alta and Baja California border region of San Diego, Tijuana, from where she is joining us today. So Melinda, I'll let you take it away and pull up your presentation to get us started on the why and the how of the race survey.
So thank you, Susanna, Rodrigo, and Elia for inviting me to this conversation and for the ongoing collaborative effort from you and the rest of the museum staff that has led to the launching of this project today. I would also like to recognize my own 20-year plus collaborator, Tae Hwang, who's in Baltimore presently, as well as the current transnational digital team, Abigail Borges, Adrián Orozco, Lilia Flores, and Jose Iniguez, for making the transition to producing this work online possible. It's an honor to bring the Collective Magpie practice to El Museo del Barrio for La Trienal, a national art platform that through its existence functions as a counter voice in this present day reality plagued by xenophobia, racism, and a fear of the browning of the United States. These days reveal a worsening of long unaddressed systematic problems across our most vulnerable populations. The most affected we know are our Black and brown people. We also know that as visual artists, all of us, what we do is to make aspects of our culture, our current shared reality seen and experienced through art. We as artists can take parts of our present that might otherwise go unnoticed or left out of the archives and use them to challenge otherwise fixed perspectives at every level of society in an infinite number of ways. The collective magpie practice is guided by our own liminal, inescapable psychic experience as immigrants, which we have used to find ways of working with the quotidian material of our everyday shifting environments, and create frameworks that invite different publics to use to respond and intervene in site-specific concerns of the situations we find ourselves in. The frameworks we construct are used through public participation to make the small into the spectacular and seen, but most importantly, to allow the public we identify to explore the complexity of the situations we locate. And as we have found ourselves in the San Diego-Tijuana region for most of the past decade, our work has responded to what we were most affected by there. And to give you all a good sense of where the 2020 Poetic Exploration of Race survey that launches today is coming from and responding to, I will start this 25-minute presentation with an introduction to our geographic binational context. Then I will introduce a public artwork from the history of this region that our practice connects to. And we'll speak to its creation as a means for making local connections visible, to be engaged with in a complex way, and share examples of how our public artworks do the same, but in a very different manner. To do this, I will share examples from our Transnational Seminar created between 2017 and 18 that show how and why the Poetic Exploration of Race survey came to be, and what it is now doing with Museo El Barrio, and how you can participate. Okay. San Diego is on the left here, with Tijuana's metropolis colliding with its outskirts in the right. Tijuana is about a 30-minute drive from San Diego, and it can be 40 minutes to a 4-hour-plus trip in the other direction, depending on delays and your level of clearance. Over 50 million people cross this border each year, giving the local San Ysidro port of entry the title of one of the most frequently trafficked borders in the world. Our cities are deeply woven together and affect each other, from environmental implications to interdependent economies to daily social and political impact, and everything in between. Artists, of course, continually speak to the imbalanced relationship between these two cities. And I'd like to share a piece from 1988, Welcome to America's Finest Tourist Plantation. It's a public artwork in the form of a bus advertising poster by artists Elizabeth Sisko, David Avalos, and Louis Hawk. For clarification of this title, Welcome to America's Finest Tourist Plantation, it's a play on the San Diego City motto, America's Finest City. A claim definitely not as nationally recognized as the Big Apple, but is meant to name the city and call out the hypocrisy of that claim by tying it to exploited undocumented labor for the benefit of the tourist industry. I take issue with the too clean a direct parallel of the abuse and exploitation of undocumented workers as equal to Black slaves on plantations as problematic in this piece, and also find it something worth critiquing. But what I would like to highlight in this story is the planning the artist utilized that became the structure for this art project to have been effective and function in the streets, in museums, and in the press. For this work, the artist carefully coordinated to secure advertising space on 100 city buses at the time the Super Bowl was in San Diego. And while the messaging of the poster was unrecognized by people in town for the Super Bowl, it was crystal clear to both the local hoteliers and tourism officials, whose defensive responses insisting there was no relationship between the tourist industry and undocumented labor, was picked up like wildfire by local press. And the public art project moved. It was then debated with increasing complexity over multiple media formats, with 15 television stories on the project and one station covering it 6 times. So for at least a couple of months, this public art project was able to reframe the argument of the role of the undocumented worker. that the wealthy business owners wanted to keep in the shadows. When the border wall prototypes went up in the city of San Diego, the city put $1 million of its budget to prepare for their protests. But there were no significant protests here. This was because much of the population that was incensed by the prototypes and that would be inclined to protest can't make themselves visible in that manner due to being part of mixed immigration status families that make this city run. Not to mention, the site where the prototypes were installed was incredibly difficult to access and didn't allow reasonable space for holding a protest in view of them at all. So in this place where protest is very risky, we were able to harness the protections of our institutional positions, as well as utilize the space of art making to engage in explicitly critical but non-confrontational protests about border policy in the tourist districts of both of these two major border cities. And we did this through the construction of a borderland street theater. So this image is a montage from a street play as a US border wall prototype beauty pageant with our performers in their papier-mâché border wall prototype costumes against the actual prototypes installed in our town. It was with their bodies that we could move the prototypes into a place of visible discussion. As was with the taking of our range of experiences and observations with US Customs and Border Patrol, and our public exploration of different relationships with privilege. But I would like to explain how this street theater came to be from people who have zero experience in theatrical performance. It is through capitalizing on one of our ongoing things that we identify in this region with noticing the occurrence of an institutional naming of a dedication to serving both San Diego and Tijuana that could, in our observation, function even more so transnationally. And so, when we were invited by the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego through a James Irvine Foundation grant to consider engagement with millennials at a single local college in San Diego, we saw this as an opportunity to reinforce the museum's mission to serve the region binationally and establish a new precedent through creating what we named the Transnational Seminar, which, without a faculty position at any university, but as resident artists with the Contemporary Art Museum, and with a great deal of institutional maneuvering, we were able to work with UABC in Tijuana, UC San Diego, and Southwestern College to create the structure of this nomadic accredited art studio that brought students together from the Research 1, Research 2, and Community College to meet together in different places across San Diego and Tijuana for 5-hour sessions on Fridays over 27 weeks for collaborative production. And it is with this space that we activated the Borderlands Street Theater. And our very different lived experiences, exchanges, and shared observations became the content for the work produced. We utilized methodologies of Brazilian theater director and legislator Augusto Boal for our participating students to construct plays as actors and non-actors from what they were upset about, what their communities were upset about. And it was those sentiments that was taken to the tourist centers in San Diego and Tijuana to be engaged with by the people there. Ever present in this work was the inspiration of former Mayor Bogota, Colombia, Antanas Mocu's use of street theater and performance strategies to aid the transformation of the incredible challenges the city faced, from violence to water conservation, to the most famous being the unbelievable reformation of traffic fatalities with heavy-handed use of mimes performing in the streets to remind its citizens of traffic etiquette. In our case, what we were actively seeking was to render visible through our bodies a larger community dialogue around issues we saw as living somewhat in the shadows. The second framework and intervention I would like to share is the one that led directly to the development of the Poetic Exploration of Race survey. At the time, we were holding a few of our seminar sessions at the MCA San Diego, while the Dimensions of Black exhibition was up. It was a large survey of works by Black artists from the permanent collection, and the first exhibition the museum named as having curated expressly along racial lines. A museum educator gave our seminar a tour of the show, after which the students were presented with a survey about their experience of the exhibit. While strongly impacted by the show in ways we continued to unpack over several weeks, our binational group of students leaving this show, named for its Blackness, had a very challenged immediate response to the first question on the museum survey, which was, "What is your race?" Check the box. The San Diego-based students were very familiar with institutional demographic questions, but the Mexican students were not. In fact, for all of them, it was the first time they had been asked to define their race, and they were upset by a process that forced a fixed definition that they felt didn't match their lived reality. And if half of our group was upset, it made everyone upset. Although the race and ethnicity categories presented were taken from the 2010 US Census, there was no way to check the box for the student with a Black German father and Morena Mexican mother who grew up in Tijuana. That this student felt reflected her understanding of herself in this moment of, for the first time, defining her race. And as a group, we experienced the transformation of race and ethnicity as part of our ongoing experience together. We observed this in the many ways we were understood as white or not white, and how that whiteness was read. It changed weekly, depending on which side of the US-Mexico border we were on. So our response to this experience was to create a demographic survey as an artwork. This poetic exploration of race survey reinterprets a mashup of questions from the 2010 US and Mexican census forms. In this context, the US Census is used for a number of reasons, primarily because it is how the United States declares its official race categories. As such, it is one of the ways that our understandings and attitudes towards race are shaped. But who has declared what race in what year has changed throughout its existence. White was always named, and a tracing of the less than fully human category of Black people can also be observed, as well as the category of Mexican shifting back and forth as white or not white several times. And in this history of census contingencies and relationalities of racial identities that are each time declared as fixed is disproven within its own archive. But on our census, we use the word feeling as a further negotiator and specifier between the self and the race or ethnicity category on the blue section of our survey. I feel, for instance, white has the options of not at all, just a little, somewhat, moderately, quite a lot, all the time, with a fill-in space to describe when and where you feel that way. And it's paired with the follow-up question. Other people describe me as white, not at all, just a little, somewhat, moderately, quite a lot, all the time, with the follow-up question of when and where that occurs. Feelings are where we could locate and begin to discuss the challenges that we had with our group's own shifting of racial identities crossing the border. Encountering the museum survey and also against conversations we had about the dimensions of Black exhibition and our own considerations around how Blackness felt and read there. What is it to not feel brown, but read brown? When and how do we understand our felt racial identities and that of others? Is it significant if it does not align with the general discourse? When? How? In what ways? The Mexican government does not conduct censuses, ethnic censuses. Its national census consists primarily of class-based questions, many of which deal with infrastructure like plumbing and floor type that doesn't readily translate in the US due to regulations. Still, we felt it important to engage similar questions from the Mexican census that would work transnationally. And we do this in the green section of our survey. After that, there are a couple of other sections that are further areas for processing both race and class. April 20th, 2017, on the trolley platform outside of the MCA San Diego, we conducted the poetic exploration of race survey within the performative environment of our handmade inflatable translucent dome. The participants were able to view the survey and pamphlet, explaining the art project, and ask questions prior to committing to take it. Our lab coat wearing students attended the survey takers as they completed their surveys in silence in a circle of 17 people at a time. It was a continuous flow of entering and leaving the dome, but we were almost always at full capacity until the event was over. So who were these people? The light rail that passes through this location connects the downtown San Diego directly to the San Ysidro port of entry. So the participants of the survey were an incredible cross-section of people who work downtown in a big range of different capacities. Also, there were commuting students, folks who were visiting the museum or on their way to dine at one of the nearby restaurants, as well as at least one member of our very large homeless community. 100 surveys were collected that day, and all of them were later available to be viewed. I'd like to read through a few example responses. One person's range. I feel Hispanic, just a little. Growing up in a border town implies a presence of two cultures. Others described me as Hispanic somewhat when I was young and being biracial was rare. I feel Latina, just a little, when I spend time with my amazing in-laws. Others describe me as Latina somewhat when I disappear into the ambiguity of brown skin. I feel Spanish, not at all. I don't identify with the colonizers. I feel Mexican American somewhat with my first generation life partner, bonding over shared experiences. I feel Chicana, not at all. I only have a minor knowledge base of Chicana issues and history. This trend in seeing how the ethnic categories were directly tied to experiences with place, family, history, and cultural ideas was something that showed up again and again in participant responses. Another person described themselves with these two indications. I feel white all the time, every day. Other people describe me as white every day. It seems to be my skin tone. While this is the standard notion about how race functions, it was actually much less common, rare even, in the way that people responded to our survey. Here's another example of environmentally determined race feelings. I feel white somewhat at work when I speak in technical white-collar finance terms. Others describe me as white somewhat when I'm with friends who speak differently. I feel Black, not at all. Others describe me as Black, just a little, when they point out I am not white. Through an interdisciplinary collaboration with a political data analyst, we were able to employ the tools of public opinion surveys and see our participants' responses as data that we could locate patterns within in a similar fashion. So here in this infographic, we use the US race and ethnicity data about San Diego as a point of contrast to our findings. The first infographic we made looks like this. The census results of 51% white people to 45% people of color versus our survey saying 14% white people to 86% people of color. But in our survey, white would be people who indicated they feel white all the time and nothing else, with people of color being those who indicated they felt a category other than white all of the time and no other categories, or felt two or more categories, some to all of the time. But the second infographic we made changed this, with the same 51% white, 45% people of color from the census, but naming the 4% unknown. And in our survey, the numbers change to 14% white people, to 3% people of color, and a third category, mixed, with 83%. But white people, again, are those who indicated they feel white all the time and nothing else. But in this infographic, people of color are instead those who indicated they feel a category other than white all of the time and nothing else, with the third category of mixed being people who indicated that they felt two or more categories, some to all of the time. Ultimately, we use this data comparison. And those percentages were sign painted at the same location where the survey was conducted as part of the Who Designs Your Race mural on the MCA San Diego, with the full 100 surveys on exhibit, along with all of the artwork produced via the Transnational Seminars. So this brings us to 2020, introducing Who Designs Your Race for this time of physical distancing. The Poetic Exploration of Race survey has been placed online to function as a public participatory artwork that can be engaged with on the internet, and will function both there and in the physical space of El Museo del Barrio. In this instance, to update our survey, we kept the same structure based on the 2010 US and Mexican census, but had the museum modify the survey to reflect its understanding of its primary audience and location in New York City. However, regardless of your location on the planet, the survey is open to all who are able to access it online. And the way it is set up, the first question on the survey is a Google map search field. And the question, where do you spend most of your time? Of course, enter the location you are most comfortable with sharing. Please don't put in your home address. But what this does is tie all of a survey taker's anonymous information to their indicated geographic location, allowing for the ability to identify patterns in survey responses tied to physical locations anywhere on the planet. For instance, if New York City and San Diego have an equal number of participants, we can compare how people in these two cities are feeling about their understanding of their race right now. And the point of conducting a survey now in the wake of increased suffering and racial turmoil during a pandemic is to offer a glimpse through the mediated space of public art into how people describe what it is that they're feeling about their race right now. And that will be presented for the upcoming Trienal. And to contribute to the results with depth, you and everyone you know needs to take it. It officially, again, launches today, so you can take it right after this talk at theracesurvey.com. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. Thanks for giving us that really thorough overview of some of the art historical and I think also sociological references that you're pulling from in the creation of this piece. And also for really introducing to all of us that, you know, starting today, we hope you will all go to theracesurvey.com because again, it will feed into the second part of Collective Magpie's contribution of ESTAMOS BIEN, which will be some of these infographics related to the results that are pulled. So I know that link is in the chat, so please be sure to check it out. So Melinda, we've actually already started to get a first question, and it's from someone who's in Nova Scotia. This is something that you've already talked about. You were just saying about the site specificity of this particular iteration of the race survey. I wanted to acknowledge that we worked internally at El Museo to try and talk out what exactly was that site specificity, but obviously you're coming from the borderlands. All of us online are currently in different spots, perhaps around the globe. And do you see that as a challenge to entering this online space or to moving the survey online? Can you talk about the process that we all underwent in moving from paper to pencil to the online space?
Okay, sure. Well, in terms of, you know, one of the key changes from going from the old version to the present version was a decision not to use the 2020 changes to the survey, to the US Census, to create this 2020 update. And that the transformation of the different defined race and ethnicity categories that are on the race survey that's online were defined by Museo del Barrio. And it makes sense that a work that is coming from the borderlands is connecting to the Latino contemporary art entity on the other end of the country. And in terms of locating site specificity, it depends on who is participating, right? It's how that information is presented can be international. If we get a lot of representation in Canada, if I'm Canadian, then perhaps that also, you know, can be included with what is being presented at Museo. But at the same time, it's important to have a local engagement with the communities there. And you have this incredible effort that's that started with on your end with the working in the streets. So that too is contributing to this data set, if that helps answer that question.
I think so. And I think it's also, I mean, you hit it on the head that we're here in New York, you're there in Baja California. And that's also part of what we wanted to bring out with expanding La Trienal to a more national scope and to be able to work with different artists who identify in some ways, or maybe in challenging ways they don't identify with this Latinx category. We're really interested in the intersectionality of that term. And we were speaking earlier about your survey, or about Collective Magpie's survey, as perhaps an intersectional tool. It, I think, at times exposes contradictions within ourselves that, you know, we all live with our own contradictions that perhaps ultimately are not so contradictory. And that doesn't even get into gender or religious components. You're really only talking about race, ethnicity, some economic factors. So I don't know if you want to talk about intersectionality either on a personal level or through the perspective of the survey.
I think, you know, personally, being a person who has a mother from Trinidad, a father from Peru, being born in Canada, and primarily growing up in the Southwest of the United States, and where I'm frequently read as Mexican, without initially having any contact with that country. I spent a lot of time living in Mexico, and at this point, have a lot of transnational engagement. So I myself would like to be able to speak to the intersectionality of my own experience, but be able to afford a matrix, a system for our racialized bodies that can be simultaneously critiqued and offer an intersection of descriptions of how it is that you are owning your racial identity in a multitude of ways, allowing for there to be an intersectional conversation.
And I think we had a question that I think relates, asking, could you speak to the way the US Census separates race and ethnicity, with ethnicity having only two categories, Hispanic and non-Hispanic? I mean, maybe I hope Nikki, who asked this question, goes to theracesurvey.com and sees the myriad.
I was going to say this, that we included much more categories on ethnicity, even compared to your first iteration, right? I think
it's almost double.
The ongoing conversation we had about indigeneity and ethnicity.
On this survey, there's no named distinction between race and ethnicity. It is a feeling-based survey about the felt experience about race, not a technical categorization that is fitting within a pre-existing logic, if that helps to make sense, right? It's like we understand, and are read by the way our races read. It starts to become a finer tooth comb often to start to separate the two, what the difference between the two in the felt experience. But there's still room in the survey to name it, right? If that is a problem, to speak against that, to critique it, to take it apart. And that's part of what it's intended to do.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I wanted to ask you about something that I've been thinking a lot during the process of doing this work together with you. I think it's really interesting because we approached you from the perspective of you guys having already one experiment or two experiments having taken place, that you did, especially the one in San Diego, that was really resonant to us and interesting to us. But the way we approached you was really to recreate that for the internet space. And obviously that speaks of the current moment we all experienced, where of course race occupied a much more prominent and important space in everyone's agenda, but also during the COVID-19 pandemics, where we've been separated from public space in a quite drastic way, unprecedented way. So I think it's really a collaboration, as you always say, between the institution and Collective Magpie. But on that note, because I know that inclusion is something very important to this project, and this is when we talk about, and I can say something that I mentioned on my, when you first presented to the staff, how me coming from a different culture, I really experienced the whole racialization from a very strange perspective and not to be inclusive at all, right? So having a hard time just to fill out any fields on any forms, taking my kids to school and whatever. But I wanted to pick up or touch on something that I know, a reference that I know it's also dear to you in the context of this question about inclusion. There's a quote of Paulo Freire that is in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I know Paulo Freire is dear to you, it is very dear to me as well. There is no impartiality. And this is one of these quotes that really circulates in the internet's everywhere, but it's indeed the pedagogy of the oppressed. It said there's no impartiality, all are guided by an ideological base, right? The question, the only question that is your ideological basis inclusive or exclusive? And I wanted to ask you, I mean, who designs your race? How is your, our survey more inclusive than other official surveys, and how can we use it to build a more inclusive reality?
Okay.
Thank you.
So essentially, you know, you are asking, you know, how Paulo Freire would ask, you know, who designs your race? And, you know, in our survey asks for it to be critiqued. So on that level of inclusion, you can do whatever you want with those categories. You can change them however you would like. There's a structure there, but how you respond to it, there's a fill in the blank portion. The information that you offer is up to you. But we live in this interconnected world, and we must struggle to work through our challenges together. So I don't know that, you know, what exactly can be prompted by our survey. And my reading of Paulo Freire as it applies to this situation would suggest that structures like racial categorization that becomes a means of keeping people oppressed. And it's the burden of those most oppressed to find ways to speak, to communicate, and elevate our collective consciousness and not repeat the oppression in another form. Right? So at the end, we design our races, we define how they function, we describe what they mean and where they came from. But who that we is, that is the epic battle. And a question for those who suffered the most from their racial categories. You know, it is how this present system of control can be changed by those who are not currently in control. Not as a flipping of power, but how do we create a more humane and equitable world? And how does that happen with people who will never comprehend the suffering they caused? I don't know how, right? But we must do this work together. And, you know, perhaps people will tell us things in our race survey that could help with that next change, that next iteration. More conversation, more information, and more intersectionality in ways that aren't considered.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think there's this beautiful image that we keep seeing together that you created, where you sort of contrast the official result of the survey or the census in terms of people being classified or categorized as people of color or white, and that is contrasted by the result of your 100 filled out forms or questionnaires from the performance or that experience in San Diego. But I keep thinking about what people really write in the blank fields, right? So this is where some of the emancipatory may be. So I don't know, I'm just trying to sort of put together a more demographic, statistic notion in opposition to something that is maybe more poetic or is more language driven, is more of the nature of an inventory, and how we could, I'm turning this into a working section somehow, but how we can probably, use those inputs or those materials in what they have of emancipatory or subjective, or not falling into categories that are ultimately written by the oppressor, right? By the empire at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But that's great. That's. I mean, hopefully we come out with something else, or at least this. But thank you.
Melinda, I feel like when you were answering Rodrigo's question, it was almost a manifesto-like response that you had, which was really beautiful to hear. And it ties back to, as Rodrigo was saying, this notion of poetics. And I think almost at certain moments when you're taking the survey, you know, it is almost durational. It will take you 15 minutes. Again, as you said, you could answer it as you wish. There's moments that allow the person taking it to be poetic, filling in these blanks. It also allows the person to be more quantifiable, just checking boxes. So I wanted to ask you about almost that confrontation between the poetics and the quantifiable. And if you wanted to also mention about, you know, there's poetic discrepancies even in how we describe some of the racial categories, that we talked about them, and in the end we actually felt like leaving them, sometimes having Latina OX, sometimes having only Filipino, sometimes having only Chicana. If you could touch on some of those poetic touches.
You know, speaking to where the first iteration came from, like where its origin point, you know, it was out of this group of students, you know, that were heavily moved by the experience that they had together, and trying to find ways of telling each other how they were understood, right? So new words were shared between people, right? Old words to some, new words to others. And you know, that is something that was a kind of poetic exchange that we determined, like, okay, what is the series of categories that we can name that people who are here, who are often feeling not comfortable to fill out the census, can recognize themselves in the named categories in a way that signals, you know, through poetics, perhaps there's something else happening here, right? Like perhaps there's, like, you know, it doesn't have the sort of straight-laced, like, there's the formal element of the survey, but it's also very casual, you know, and so somewhere between that is where these different categories are coming from. And when with our current version, you know, I a lot of that was like passing the ball that way, you know. Here, let's talk. Let me tell you about the logic of the survey that we created. How does that make sense to your understanding of your audience? How do you engage with the poetic description and naming of race and ethnicity categories within your community as a neighborhood museum?
I wanted to say, I know we are quickly running out of time, but we did want to briefly talk about some other artistic references, or maybe we should just mention, maybe there's not enough time to talk about them in full, but how other artists have also used the language of the survey to inform their own practice. So you and I were talking about Teresa Burga, who had been featured recently in Radical Women, who has a piece called Profile of the Peruvian Women, in which she took out a survey in the newspaper and worked with sociologists. And that later, again, turned into different artistic pieces that she presented in the gallery. So perhaps not so dissimilar to some of the part of the goals, I should say. I don't think the infographics are actually the end goals at all of your survey. I think the practice or the experience is what you're aiming for. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I would love to speak to her practice and in a sort of similarly spirited investigation. But I'm super struck by her own lived reality when, you know, she's working for the Peruvian government after, you know, doing art school in Chicago. And at that critical moment in which the shift of the mega system of organization of human information goes to computerization. The Peruvian government is computerizing its systems. And she's a part of that, and she sees that. And then she produces her own, you know, didactics, her own infographics, her own processing, and situates that along with sculptural objects. And there's something in there that speaks directly to the, not quite a reanimation of the, you know, the domestication or the flattening of the quantifying of the organic into the digital, but it's there. It is, and that hard to name.
I think we are.
I think you froze.
Kinship, you know, fit in the word.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Oh, I froze? Oh, that's where the kinship is, right? In that liminal space.
Well, we have, I think, perhaps, I think our last question, since we are definitely running up to the time, but it's a really wonderful question, which I'm going to read the full contribution. So the race survey focuses on how and when people feel in relation to racial categories. This is highly relevant to recent popular culture in the US. There have been several instances in which white people, women, reveal that they have presented themselves and lived their professional lives as Black people. The most well-known case might be Rachel Dolezal, but there have been others within the last few weeks. So given what you've learned from the poetic explorations of Who Designs Your Race, can you talk a bit about how you interpret events like these?
Complicated, it's complicated, painful. You know, that's me as a person responding to that. The Rachel Dolezal story, which felt so crystal clear to me, became complicated. You know, after watching her documentary and having a sense of, you know, understanding her, how she, you know, her relationship with her family, her own relationship to her siblings, you know, I can't offer a flat response to that. I think, you know, it is really in the nuance of the details, and being able to meet each detail along the way is really important to engaging with notions of problem and problems of race. No, it's not okay to, you know, receive scholarships undercover as a person of color if, you know, that isn't your lived reality. That's not okay. But it doesn't mean that there isn't also perhaps psychically complicated story to be told. That's how I might respond to that.
Well, I think this concept of nuance versus official histories, that might be a good place for us to end. And I feel almost uncomfortable suggesting this, but I do think that it would be interesting for those of you who are joining us tonight. If you haven't taken the census, it is really important. We have a very low response among the Latino, Latinx population. So an interesting exercise could be taking the official government-sponsored survey and then giving yourself the time to reflect on that experience in relation to the survey, the poetic survey that Collective Magpie has proposed for La Trienal. It's, again, a very interesting experience that we hope that you all sit with, and it's available at theracesurvey.com or via El Museo's website. We're also hoping to do some activations perhaps in the street, so please stay tuned. Please encourage your friends to complete the survey, and then in the spring you can come back and see the infographics that you will have contributed to. And just to announce that we will have our final online artist project debuting in late October. So we hope to see you all then. And thank you. Thanks so much, Melinda. Thank you, Collective Magpie, as well as all of our El Museo colleagues who made tonight's event possible and who helped shape the survey.